Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in a series of lectures by IPFW featured faculty. We have two more after this next week. We have Rick Sutter, and then the following week, the last of the series, will be Clinton Dixie. But today, I'm honored to introduce the chair of the history department and a true outstanding scholar here at IPFW, Bernd Fischer, who will speak about Albania and the communist era.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Comrade Enver, and that's what we like to refer to him as, of course, would be very pleased to see all of you here. He developed one of the most extreme cults of the personality in the Balkans, and I suspect any sort of interest this long after his death would warm his heart. So, what I'd like to do today, just very briefly, is start with a brief description of my project. I mean, what I'm hoping to do, and perhaps why I'm hoping to do it, and then present a little bit of an overview of the topic, basically sort of a short introduction to Enver and his times, and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges involved in doing this type of a project. In other words, working with history in the Balkans, and more specifically working with history in Albania, and then describing the status of my project to date. And finally, I have a short audio-visual extravaganza for you, and I think we probably will also have at least some time for questions. Well, let me start first with just a brief description of my project. What I'm attempting to do here is simply write a basic sort of objective political biography of Enver Hoxha. And he was the Stalinist dictator of Albania. He ruled from 1944 until his death in 1985. So he was actually the longest running of the Eastern European dictators, and had, not surprisingly, a profound effect not only on Albania but on the region as a whole. The question initially is, why do this sort of thing? I mean, why am I interested in Hoxha, in Albania in particular? And I think there are a couple of reasonable excuses for my doing this. First of all, I find Hoxha and Albania in general to be inherently fascinating, as certainly have others. The Hoxha period in Albanian history has been described as a collage of fantasies by one historian. Another, and this is one of my personal favorites, has described Albania as the type of place that would make a surrealist weep with joy. There are other considerations, however, and they include, first of all, the need to understand Hoxha in order to understand Albania. I don't think it's possible to understand Albania in the 21st century, its politics, its social structure, without having some basic background in terms of the development of Hoxha's regime, and particularly Hoxha's role during the war. I mean, these two issues, the war and Hoxha, really sort of inform contemporary Albanian politics, I think, to a much greater extent than, say, Ceausescu in Romania or Zhivkov in Bulgaria. In the broader context, I think we can also learn a good deal about developing societies by looking at Albania during the Hoxha period and immediately thereafter, and perhaps also learn something about the imposition of alien ideologies on developing societies. This is actually something that Albania tried during the regime of King Zog, who was Hoxha's predecessor, also to not very good effect, I'm afraid. My Albanian colleagues, I think, would be the first to admit that so far no real objective biography of Hoxha has been produced in Albania. Again, I think partially because of the fact that the issue is still so contemporary. There has, of course, been some material produced, but it tends to be written by either people who spent years in his prisons and as a result don't have a particularly positive attitude, or people within his family, within his inner circle, who essentially, of course, are trying to justify their own roles in Albania during the Hoxha period, as well as justifying Hoxha himself. So I think there's certainly room for this. The project, I think, will take quite some time, but again, I think there is a need to look at this individual to understand Albania and its neighbors. And lastly, some of you may be aware, I mean, I've been dealing with Albanian topics for many years now, probably about 30 or so, and I've published a number of books, one dealing with King Zog, who was Hoxha's predecessor. He ruled during the interwar period. He was kicked out by Mussolini in 1939, and he dealt with some of the same problems, of course, because Albania's development has been rather slow. I also published a book dealing with Albania during World War II, which really does deal with Hoxha in his initial developmental phase. I edited a book dealing with Albanian history and myth, which is a problem in dealing with Hoxha, as I'll explain momentarily. And then I published a book, or edited a book rather, dealing with Balkan dictators, and that essentially includes a short chapter of Hoxha, which will sort of become the basis for what I do. In any case, all of these books have been translated into Albanian, and they have been generally well received, I'm pleased to say, and read, I think, by people within the inner circle. Last year, on the 100th anniversary of Hoxha's birth, Hoxha's wife, Nejmia, who we will see momentarily, gave a series of interviews to Albanian television and print media, and actually at one point suggested that I should be the person to write the biography of Hoxha, which was sort of a nice compliment. I mean, a seal of approval from the dictator's wife, after all. But more importantly, it also indicates that she is open to speak to me. And you know, a lot of these people, the old Politburo people, have been around for a long time, but they tend to be rather low-key in modern Albania for obvious reasons. With Hoxha's wife's approval, I also have now got access to a whole bunch of the major players. So it, I think, will help significantly with my research, at least in terms of getting their perspective on the various issues with which we will deal. Okay, let me start with, again, this sort of brief overview of Hoxha and his times. He certainly was, in many respects, a unique individual. He had a complex and contradictory personality. On the one hand, he was well-read and cultured and well-traveled. And on the other hand, he almost delighted in his own brutality, which was an unfortunate significant factor in his regime. On the one hand, he was intelligent and again extremely well educated. He certainly can't be compared to the other crushingly boring Eastern European dictators like Ceausescu and Zhivkov, but he saw the world in completely black and white terms. I mean, he grossly distorted events and refused to face evidence if it in any way contradicted a position that he had already taken. So there's a real paradox, and this creates problems too, of course, with dealing with the material that he himself produced, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. He comes from a pretty much middle-class Muslim family. Most Albanians, as I'm sure some of you are aware, are Muslims even today. He came from the south, one of the fortunate elite, I would suggest, who was able to gain a scholarship to study abroad. He spent some time in France during the 1930s, and it's here, although he speaks about this at length, indeed ad nauseum, he's not very specific in terms of who he actually came in contact with to lead him in this direction, in other words, in a leftist direction. He ultimately returns to Albania in the late 1930s and is one of the original communists. Now, there weren't very many of them in Albania in the 1930s, principally because of the fact that there weren't any workers. I mean, probably 98% of the population made their living through agriculture or animal husbandry, so there wasn't really much of a base to work with. However, he did construct sort of a traditional Marxist-Leninist party based upon what is euphemistically referred to as democratic centralism, which of course simply means dictatorship. His career, however, ultimately was made during the war. Albania was invaded by the Italians in 1939, and indeed the Albanians like to argue that World War I sort of began in Albania. Ultimately, the Italians were replaced by the Germans in 1943, but for the entire period, Albania was occupied. And as a result, it became an ideal haven for resistance activity. And there were a whole series of resistance groups, nationalists, independent chieftains, and then also the communists. And of these groups, the communists ultimately became the most effective, partially because of the fact that unlike the nationalists or the chieftains, they were less concerned about reprisals. I mean, once resistance picked up, particularly under the Germans in 1943, the Germans, of course, resisted and essentially went after those who were responsible for the concept, and often very brutally. And this essentially ultimately required the non-communist resistance to sort of scale back their activities, in the sense that they were the representatives of pre-war society, and there was sort of an assumption that they would protect their people. Well, you know, with resistance, obviously, they could not protect their people, so they stopped resistance and often essentially moved into collaboration. The communists did not do this, principally because of the fact that they, of course, benefited from resistance. They had no interest in reconstructing pre-war society, and resistance and reprisals drove people into the mountains and therefore into the various chetas organized by the communists. So he played a role in harassing the Germans. He certainly didn't defeat them, which unfortunately is the argument that many Albanians have made after World War II. But he played a role, and he certainly was responsible for pinning down a good number of Italian troops, probably, and German troops, probably about 2.5 divisions or so, troops which, of course, could otherwise be used elsewhere. More importantly for him, however, because of the fact that during the course of the war, his resistance increased, at the end of the war, he was really the only person standing. I mean, the Communist Party was it. I mean, all other earlier resistance organizations had fallen into collaboration and therefore were no longer in the running for post-war political roles. This put him in a position to essentially start from scratch and create a regime based upon his basic Marxist-Leninist principles, to which he ultimately added Stalinism. And Stalin sort of becomes one of his sort of personal guides in terms of policy, both in, economic and political. So he sets up a traditional Stalinist state and a traditional Stalinist economy, again based upon this sort of democratic centralism, collectivization, massive industrialization. These were the goals. Now, he certainly had his work cut out for him. Albania, immediately after the war, was in pretty bad shape. There had, of course, been some damage, perhaps not quite as much damage as we find in Greece or Yugoslavia, but the biggest problem was simply the level of underdevelopment. As I mentioned, Albania was still overwhelmingly agrarian. By the time we get to 1944, maybe 3% of its economy is based upon industry, and much of that had actually been destroyed during the war. Agriculture wasn't ideal for Albania either, however, basically because of the fact that about 9% of the country, only 9% of the country, was arable. So, you know, Lots of mountains. It's a beautiful place, incidentally. I'll show you some examples of it momentarily. Lots of mountains, not much in the way of plains. Those that did exist tended to be malarial and as a result caused some difficulty for farmers. There were no railroads. There were perhaps no more than about 500 miles of roads, which tended to disappear in the wintertime because a lot of it wasn't paved. The illiteracy rate in Albania in 1944 was maybe 85 to 86%. The social structure can only be described as at least still partially medieval. Blood feuds, which during the war had subsided to a certain extent, came back with, if you'll pardon the expression, a vengeance after the war, and actually still constitute one of Albania's major social problems today. So lots of challenges here for Hoxha, and he attacks these problems with energy and determination. He constructs a Stalinist constitution in 1946, and this gives you an idea of how much he trusted his colleagues. In the first government, he became the general secretary of the party, the president of the Democratic Front, which was basically sort of a political organization to make it look like the communists weren't actually running things. He also became prime minister, foreign minister, defense minister, and commander-in-chief, leaving not too much for other people to do. He ultimately proves to be sort of a traditional nationalist, however. A nationalist, however, using violent Stalinist rhetoric. And his attachment to Stalin is really unprecedented. It basically is pretty close to being worship. He meets Stalin 5 times and writes about it. I mean, basically sort of every minute with Stalin is pretty much documented by Hoxha. There are these wonderful stories of Hoxha sitting on the couch with Stalin watching movies about tractors, and he sort of looks up at Stalin, and Stalin utters something, and Hoxha writes it down because he figures it's critical. This love, however, was very much unrequited, and Stalin basically considered him to be little more than sort of a petty bourgeois, middle-class landowner, and at one point simply encouraged the Yugoslavs to swallow up Albania. But this never, and Stalin clearly, or Hoxha clearly knew about it. It never really discouraged him, however, from continuing his near worship of Stalin. Despite the fact that there was an open field for the construction of this new regime in 44 and 45, there were a whole series of challenges to Hoxha's power. There was a pro-Yugoslav faction during the course of the war, which hoped to tie the Albanian party closer to the Yugoslav one. The Yugoslavs actually had played a role in the creation of the party in 1941. Hoxha was forced to liquidate these people. As we'll see, he liquidates many. There was also a major challenge to his position during the years 46, 48, when again the Yugoslavs sort of reared their ugly heads from his perspective and hoped to first tie Albania economically to Yugoslavia, and then again possibly even make it the 7th Republic. Once again, he is able to defeat these people, but not without shedding a tremendous amount of blood. The purges in Albania are probably more intense than elsewhere in Eastern Europe, possibly not more intense than in the Soviet Union in the 30s, but this is, I think, where he gets this notion of essentially maintaining purity within the party and removing those who constitute a threat. During the period from 47 to 52, there is an international plot organized by the CIA and the SIS, which is British MI6, to parachute actually hundreds of Albanian expatriates into the country in the hopes of sort of destabilizing the regime and possibly resulting in a wave of anti-communist demonstrations or even revolutions in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And this is a complete fiasco, partially because of the fact that at this point, a man by the name of Kim Philby, who some of you may be familiar with, was the principal liaison between SIS and the CIA, and he was a Soviet agent. And so he basically sent all of this material to Stalin, and Stalin basically gave it to Hoxha. So each one of these people, as they dropped out of their airplane, was almost immediately caught. There were show trials. Most of them were executed. Probably about 350 people died in this process. And it sort of increased his paranoia, perhaps not surprisingly. There is also and this is perhaps the last major threat to his position, a threat during the period of 56 and 57, during the de-Stalinization period, when most other Eastern European states basically sort of fell in line with the Soviet Union, arguing that Stalin was perhaps not the nice guy that everybody thought he was. Hoxha couldn't do this because he had sort of stapled himself to Stalin, and it wasn't possible he felt at least, it wasn't possible to maintain his own position while criticizing Stalin. So once again, he simply purged those who hoped for some degree of liberalization, as of course the Soviet Union experienced at this point. Again, purges, many purges, probably thousands, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people died as a result of these purges, and usually along with their family and friends, based upon the Albanian principle of collective security and collective responsibility. In other words, if someone in your family misbehaves, clearly the genes are in you as well, and these people were usually sent to relocation camps into the interior. Just to give you an idea, all 7 of Hoxha's ministers of the interior were purged as foreign agents. So one wanted to find other work, I think. Eventually, as a result of this, by the time we get to the mid-50s, the top leadership became sort of a clan bound together by their common complicity in murderous purges, and fully half of the Central Committee, made up of maybe 50 people, were related. So what Hoxha did here is he basically sort of adapted sort of clan tribal structure to the party, and he became the chief, and he became the only individual who could determine where blood feuds would be applied. It's sort of a unique feature to communism in Albania, which one doesn't find in the rest of Eastern Europe. Now, all of these various challenges led, not surprisingly, to increasing paranoia and extremism, for which Hoxha is notorious. The challenges drove Hoxha further to the left. They also drove him to seek alternative foreign sponsors. Now, Albania, even today, I would argue, is not a viable state economically. I mean, it needs outside support. This was a traditional problem during the course of the 1930s, and it was a problem in the period after World War II as well. So Hoxha found it necessary to find sort of foreign sponsors, and Albania goes through a whole series of these. The first foreign sponsor is Yugoslavia. Albania becomes sort of a sub-satellite of Yugoslavia, with Yugoslavia being a satellite of the Soviet Union, at least until 1948. And at that point, there is a split between the Yugoslavs and the Soviets, which probably saved Hoxha. I mean, his position in the summer of 1948 was extremely unstable. But with the break with Yugoslavia, Hoxha could essentially jettison the Yugoslavs and find, again, a new sponsor, in this case, the Soviet Union. He was always much more comfortable if the sponsor was sort of further away, so that there would be less potential for influence. So Albania becomes a full satellite of the Soviet Union from 1948 until the early 60s, and the de-Stalinization program, which I mentioned a while ago, ultimately encouraged Hoxha to look for yet another foreign sponsor, and the next one is China. And Hoxha essentially attaches himself to China. He was always proud of saying that we, the Albanians, and the Chinese make 1 billion people, which are the Chinese period saw, I think, an increase in the depth of his extremism. First, because of the fact that the Chinese alliance did not include a traditional military alliance, Hoxha felt increasingly insecure, principally about his neighbors, and as a result came up with a sort of unique system for self-defense, basically based upon the concept of sort of a people's militia, where everybody would be trained for a short period during the year. And in order to defend his people's militia, he, in the 1960s, built, and this is one of the probably the most bizarre features of contemporary Albania, he built about 750,000 concrete and steel bunkers throughout the country, and many of these are still there. I mean, it's difficult, I think, to travel for more than a couple of 100 yards without running into one of these. Remember, the population of Albania at this point is 3 million. So we've got 750,000 concrete and steel bunkers to protect the defenders against the supposed invaders. And there were some other sort of bizarre features of this defense system. One of my favorites is a sort of a do-it-yourself air defense system where young pioneers, in other words, communists in training, would climb to the top of trees and tie iron spikes to the top of trees. And the idea was that if the parachutists basically were not taken out by the bunkers, they'd land on these spikes. And this would save the country. He creates essentially sort of a state of siege nationalism here. In other words, everybody is the enemy, and the list basically grows and includes, first of all, the Greek monarcho-fascists, and then the Italian neo-fascists, and then the Yugoslav and the Soviet revisionists, and then the US and British imperialists. I mean, basically sort of everybody, with the possible exception of the Austrians, who actually he opens up to the Austrians during this period a little bit for economic purposes. This sort of extremism in terms of foreign policy was accompanied domestically by an ideological and cultural revolution, which to a certain extent was based upon the Chinese variant, except the goal was completely different. I mean, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was an attempt to de-bureaucratize and to decentralize. In Albania, the revolution was basically to enhance central control, And it included, again, policies which I consider to be fairly extreme, including the destruction of religion entirely. I mean, Albania in 1967 was declared to be the only atheist state in the world. All churches and mosques were closed. Hoxha constructed a museum of atheism, which was one of the most bizarre things I think I've ever seen. It was basically like 5 or 6 paintings of religious people doing nasty things to the population. This included also renaming Albanian children, in other words, to remove all religious names, and a list of acceptable names was essentially passed out to prospective parents, and it included things like the names of Albanian mountains and the names of Albanian rivers, and also some concocted ones. One of my favorite, and indeed I have a number of friends who are called Maren Glen. And any idea where that might have come from? Maren Glen? It's a combination of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. In terms of a basic conclusion with regard to my overview here, Hoxha certainly did provide some positive results. I think few, but still there were some. Certainly there were advances in terms of health care. Doctors were basically required to head out to the provinces, to areas where people had never seen a doctor in their lives. There was certainly some advance in terms of education as well. Hoxha's statistics, which are not always that reliable, suggest that by the time we get to the 1960s, illiteracy, at least for those under 40, was pretty much eradicated. We also see some infrastructure development, a whole series of these giant dinosaur petrochemical plants, which of course are now sort of a scar on the landscape. Women's rights are given at least some lip service during the communist years. The standard of living increased to a certain extent. I think Hoxha too was responsible for reducing some of the divisive factors within the Albanian political context, in other words, regionalism, and also, of course, religious division. I mean, today there are 4 major religious groups in Albania, the Orthodox in the south, Catholics in the north, and then 2 Muslim groups, Sunnis and the Bektashis, which make up maybe 20% of the Muslim population, are sort of a Shia offshoot. It's basically a mystical brotherhood which was headquartered for, I mean, since its origins in the 14th century in the Anatolian Peninsula, but in 1925, when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was attempting to secularize his state, they were driven out and they settled in Albania. So they still play an important role. And there is certainly some argument to be made that there is division in terms of the political structure as a result of religion. Well, Hoxha certainly did away with this by basically sort of doing away with religion. He advanced nationalism, I think, and contributed to the construction of a nation state, which is still sort of ongoing, I think, in Albania today. And I think perhaps most importantly, he protected Albania's independence and its territorial integrity. But much of this, of course, was offset by his rigid ideological conformity. Albania during the Hoxha years became, I would argue, basically sort of a cultural wasteland. He established extreme isolation to the point where no Albanians could travel and no one could travel to Albania. And of course, there is also his legacy of terror, which really sort of rivals that of any of the other Eastern European dictators. And much of the physical progress that Hoxha was responsible for, I would argue, was destroyed in the early 90s in the sort of extreme reaction against Hoxha once the communist regime collapsed. Just about everything that he stood for was attacked, and this included even school buildings in the provinces. I mean, people simply ripped them apart as a symbol of the regime, and was sort of anti-government as well as anti-Hoxha. So much of what one can argue he accomplished, I think, ultimately was done in, again, by the level of his extremism. When he died, his successor, Ramaz Alia, who became president of Albania and served from 1985 until 1992, refused to put the date on his tomb, and he argued that, you know, such a man can never die, which unfortunately for Albania may very well be true. Today, Albania, which I would argue basically sort of started from scratch in the 1990s, is still basically in the process of reinventing itself. How is it doing? Reasonably well. I think the transition period there is perhaps more difficult than it is in other areas of Eastern Europe. I actually the State Department asked me to write a little piece about 2 weeks ago on the challenges of democracy in Albania, and they posted it on their International Information Program's website on Friday. So there's a reading assignment for you in terms of how Albania is doing. Next, I want to talk just briefly about some of the challenges in terms of dealing with a topic like this, and there certainly are some unique ones, I would argue. One is simply the nature of history in the Balkans. I think the discipline in many respects is still developing. In the 19th century, history in the Balkans was dominated pretty much by romanticism and nationalism. Until the 1850s, it was pretty much written by patriots as opposed to scholars. It wasn't particularly objective. Objectivity ultimately is developed, but only once universities are established. And the first university in the Balkans actually wasn't established until 1837. The first university in Albania wasn't established until 1957. So there is a lag here in terms of the basic principles of the discipline, I would argue. And then, of course, after World War II, there is a very heavy Marxist influence. Just about everything written from 1945 until 1991 went through what is called the Marxist-Leninist Institute. And this was headed by Hoxha's wife, Nejmia. And she was very careful that no criticism of her husband or the party got through, and no sort of unacceptable interpretations got through either. And you know, there are all sorts of bizarre aspects to this. With the purges, whenever a major figure was purged, everything, of course, all printed material, even pictures, had to be pulled back and redone. You know, so you can sort of tell when something was written by the pictures. I mean, there's a picture of Hoxha with maybe 6 or 7 of his principal World War II generals published in 1945. By the time we get to 1950, like 2 of them are dead. You know, so there's Hoxha, and there are a couple of holes, people standing next to him. And I've seen this picture. In the 1950s, another couple of people disappear. And then finally, by the 1960s, there's just Hoxha, because all of these people are dead. History is recalled and rewritten, which sort of makes it difficult for us trying to make heads or tails of all of this stuff. With the collapse of communism in 1991, nationalism, of course, becomes in vogue once again, and there's a great interest in the history of the interwar period, of Zog, and also the various non-communist resistance movements during the war. All of this stuff is resurrected. Now, there tends to be sort of a struggle between the two extremes. The Marxists on the one hand and the nationalists on the other, and history is still very much used as a political tool in terms of elections, and it's also, of course, used as a tool in terms of education. The post-communist regimes, unfortunately, have followed the same sort of premise to a certain extent. When the Democratic Party came to power in 1992, it, of course, removed all of the textbooks and the general histories and rewrote them, which was understandable, I think, to a certain extent, based upon the lack of objectivity which they demonstrated. But when the socialists came back to power in 1997, they did the same thing. They basically sort of withdrew all the Democratic Party published material, which means everything. You know, all the high school textbooks, etc. All of it was redone. And then the Democratic Party came back to power in 2005, and again, the same thing is done. So all the books are withdrawn, burned, and essentially replaced by new interpretations. So this is an ongoing struggle. I mean, to be fair, certainly there are a bunch of younger historians now, many of them trained outside of Albania, who sort of resist this constant revisionism, and a healthy debate, I think, at least has started about why we do this every time. I mean, and I think it's sort of ongoing. Another problem with what I'm doing is basically sort of inadequate library and research facilities. I mean, the archives tend to be fairly badly organized. This, of course, was not a priority for Albania in the 1990s and 2000 and beyond, basically because of the fact that they have huge, huge problems simply in terms of keeping the state together. So this will change, I think, certainly within the next decade or so, but it certainly has been a problem to date. Also restricted access to this material, because a lot of these people are, or actually all of them, are appointed based upon their political position. There's no real civil service in Albania. You know, when one party comes to power, there is sort of a clean sweep of everybody, because this is why people support parties, the prospect of getting a job. And so, you know, a new director of the archives comes to power whenever a new political party comes to power. And most of these people, of course, are at least undereducated in terms of archival research and what to do with archives. So that clearly is a problem. Also, certainly much of the material was sort of culled during the Hoxha period. I mean, much of it was destroyed. Again, material which didn't fit into the worldview of Enver Hoxha has, of course, often disappeared. Nevertheless, I soldier on in terms of all of this, and I think I've actually made some progress. I've been plowing through the secondary source material, and there certainly is a good deal of it, including the often exhausting 80 volumes of Hoxha's memoirs. You know, don't make me pull this trigger. Some of it is interesting, but again, because of the fact that it was written essentially by an army of writers, and because of the fact that it was constantly being revised, and because of the fact that, as with many of these memoirs of communist dictators, well, you find a verbatim conversation 50 years before. You know, I mean, you got to wonder whose memory is quite that good. I don't think Hoxha's was. More revealing, I think, is the archival work which I've been able to do. I've worked in Washington, and there the State Department OSS CIA files are certainly very useful, particularly for the last years of the 1940s. By the time we get to the early 50s, relations have been broken between Albania and the United States, and as a result, we just have some CIA material, which sometimes is interesting, but often is sort of speculative. But still, for the period up until, say, the early 50s, the archives in Washington are good. I spent some weeks in London during the summer looking at the Foreign Office, the War Office, and some recently released SIS and MI6 files. And some of this material actually was quite interesting. I mean, some of the MI6 stuff from the early 50s was actually just released about 2 years ago. And it's basically sort of radio transmissions, intercepts. And this was when the Albanians were just sort of in the process of developing their sort of secret agencies. They hadn't really gotten it down yet. So they used real names of people. I have a list of their agents in Italy in the 1950s. Plus, you know, direct instructions to these agents. I mean, one of them was great. It said, you know, you can go ahead and kill these people, but make sure that it looks like the Italians did it. You know, by the time we get to the 60s, the Albanians become a little bit more sophisticated in their Sigurimi, which is the Secret Service material. This summer, I hope to do some work in the archives in Tirana, and I've also been conducting interviews with some of the principals, including Ramaz Alia, who was Hoxha's successor, an interesting and vibrant 84-year-old who was still very ideological, and also a bit careful. I interviewed him a couple of months ago, and I picked him up at his apartment. We went to a restaurant, and you know, first he wanted to have coffee to see whether or not we could get along, and then we proceeded with the interview. At the end of like 3 hours, I offered to drive him home, and he said, "No, I have my people with me." And then he looked around, and like 6 people stood up. You know, like okay, okay. I just returned from Albania about 2 weeks ago, and I had a chance to interview Nejmia Hoxha, Enver's wife, who also is, she's 88, and she is still quite ideological. But what I'm hoping with regard to these individuals is to get some sort of personal materials. I know what they're going to say in terms of politics, but you know, these people obviously saw Enver Hoxha on a daily basis, and clearly they have material which they haven't told other people, which I hope to sort of get out of them at some point. Anyway, wish me luck. Let me finish. I've got about 10 minutes left with just a quick audio-visual extravaganza here. This is sort of the classic official portrait of Hoxha, which one sees everywhere, and which I went to Albania for the first time in 1988, which was still about 3 years before the collapse of communism, during the regime of Ramazalia. And Ramazalia, of course, sort of continued with the Hoxha cult of the personality. So his pictures were everywhere. They were on the sides of mountains. I mean, it was quite remarkable. Here is a sort of a classic World War II photo of him. He was only about 33 when he founded the Command Socialist Albanian State in 1944, and indeed actually the oldest of the Politburo members at the time. Here is Hoxha. This is one of the early pictures of Hoxha and his generals. All of these guys eventually disappeared. So this is the picture that I've seen from the 70s with Hoxha standing by himself with the flowers. And here he is with his great guide, Stalin. There's Hoxha and Molotov and some unidentified Soviet officer in Stalin. I mean, you can actually even just look at him. The way he looks at Stalin. And here's a large statue of Stalin. When I visited Albania for the first time in 1988, there still were statues of Stalin all over the place. They, of course, had come down everywhere else in 1956, but in 1998, they were still there, and indeed weren't actually taken down until 1991. This is sort of one of the central squares in Tirana, and the largest of these Stalin statues. There's Hoxha with his wife Nejmia. This is actually Nejmia in the 50s. She too was a partisan during the war, and there are pictures of her in tents fighting the Germans. There's me with Nejmia. Well, actually, there's one of the pictures of her in a tent. And this is Ramazalia, the successor of Hoxha, the guy that became president from 1985 until 1992. And there's me with Ramazalia. I promise I don't have a picture of myself with Stalin. And this is Hoxha's hometown. It's a place called Gjirokastër in the south. It's a beautiful, beautiful, actually it's sort of a small city at this point. UNESCO World Heritage Site, classic example of sort of Mediterranean Turkish architecture. Hoxha's hometown in the south. And this is actually the port of Saranda, which is the southernmost Albanian port. As you can see, the Adriatic, or Albania as it comes down to the Adriatic, is quite mountainous, unlike the Adriatic on the Italian side, which is pretty flat. It will, I think, in the long run, stand Albania in good stead in terms of the potential for tourist development. I mean, there are tens and tens of miles of totally unexploited beaches, unexploited basically because there's no infrastructure. I mean, you can't get to them. I think in the future this will help Albania tremendously. It's a small enough country. I mean, the population today is probably only about 3.4 million. So tourism, I think, could ultimately have a great impact. Here we have some social realism, again, except for the graffiti, of course, from the Hoxha period. There are many of these. Again, the whole wartime experience became sort of a leitmotif for everything. I mean, all of the operas that were produced, I mean, even the coins. In 1988, the 50 Chendarka coin on the reverse side had a partisan sort of stepping on a German. This is in 1988. I mean, it was something that was sort of drilled into Albanians. Here is one of the bunkers, and there I am pointing at the enemy. I could, of course, be pointing in any direction because they were everywhere. But some of these are huge. I mean, some of them are small. They're big enough for maybe 2 people. I mean, people use them for flower pots and, you know, urinals and things. But some of the bigger ones have been turned into restaurants and houses. It's not possible to get rid of them all. I mean, there are simply too many of them. At least the beaches have been cleared more or less in anticipation of an influx of tourism, which hopefully will happen soon. Bunkers. A fine example of the monuments of totalitarianism, I think. I mean, when you think about it, again, you know, there are 750,000 of these, and you know, people in Albania in the 70s living in pretty substandard housing. The amount of money that was put into the construction of these things certainly equals the amount of money that was put into the construction of housing during the same period. Here I am with, this actually is the president of Albania from 2002 to 2007. And he was a deputy minister of defense during the Hoxha period and the great bunker builder. I mean, his job was to build all the bunkers. And he has little bunkers around his office, you know. But he was, you know, I talked about bunkers with him, and he was very happy to go into excruciating detail. This is downtown Tirana, actually as it looked in 1988. And this is the hotel, Tirana International Hotel, built in 1979. The tallest building in the country up until about the 1990s. And as you can see, there's not much in the way of traffic. Private vehicles were outlawed, so there were maybe 2,000 cars in the country until 1991. And then in a 6-month period, the Albanians imported about 180,000 used cars, mostly from Italy, many of them stolen. Without an infrastructure, you know, so but there were no gas stations, there was no place to get your car fixed, there were no roads, there was also no driving school. So in the first years, it became quite dangerous simply walking around the streets. This is actually these are the wonderful buildings built by Mussolini, the sort of Art Deco-ish construction. He built the center of Tirana in the 1930s for Zog. This is a huge gold statue of Hoxha. There it is. And it ultimately came down in a riot in 1991. This is what downtown Tirana looks like today. Actually, I took this picture just 2 weeks ago. Here are some of the rest of the wonderful Italianate buildings. As you can see, there are now large office complexes, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the, I find this to be a sort of a real shame, is that a lot of these buildings were essentially built on the top of these fabulous old Turkish villas. I mean, Tirana was pretty much a city of Turkish villas up until 1991. But there were so many property disputes about these villas that it was easier simply to tear them down and build like a 20-story high-rise, and everybody gets a floor. You know, so unfortunately, Tirana is looking less and less interesting. This is Skandarbeg Square, downtown Tirana. Here is a silver-plated Hummer. There are only 3 of them in the country, and they're owned by sort of principal mafioso guys. I actually went to a restaurant owned by one of these people once. I didn't know until afterwards, but he arrived with his entourage, and it was like something out of a movie. You know, he sat down next to me. People came up and kissed his hand, and this almost floored me. The ringtone on his phone was the theme from The Godfather. Again, this is downtown Tirana. This is the Etham Bey Mosque, which is a wonderful 17th century mosque, and then the Italianate architecture from the 30s, and then the sort of Hoxhaist opera house. This is Hoxha's villa, called Villa Number 1. It's sort of fallen into some disrepair. And this is actually the crown, just to show you that I'm not a communist, this is the crown prince of Albania. That's it. Questions? Questions? Thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little over here. Yes?
I'm curious, are you ever tempted to try to interpret Hoxha as kind of like an expression of Albanian heritage, kind of the same way George Kennan saw, you know, the sources of Soviet contact as being Russian paranoia? Are you tempted to look at Hoxha as being this, you know, like Mediterranean, Adriatic family blood feud?
I think so. I mean, despite the fact that he spent a good deal of time abroad, he clearly was faced with the same problems that his predecessor was faced with. So the policies are often pretty much the same. They're just sort of cloaked in this sort of extreme Stalinism. I mean, he did more or less the same things that Zog did, but he made it sound like it's ideological. And as I suggested, I mean, certainly the Politburo and the Central Committee ultimately became a little clan, and he used ingrained concepts in terms of Albanian society to ensure his hold on power. So even if he perhaps was not inclined in that direction personally, I think ultimately he recognized that he couldn't deal with Albanian politics and society without sort of reverting back to the traditions, you know, for sure. Yeah.
What kind of security surrounds Mrs. Hoxha?
Not very much, as far as I know. I mean, she lives in a former chicken farm just outside. I mean, it's a comfortable enough place. I think there are probably 2 people there, but you know, when I was there was just a maid in evidence. I think the apartment next door is her security. There certainly is security because she's not a very popular person amongst lots of Albanians. Yeah. Well, thank you very much again. I appreciate your having come.